Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the 2024 ACS National Convention. After last night, I hope you're all feeling even half as engaged and inspired and energized as I do. That was one heck of a great dinner, and I thank everyone, the speakers, the staff, for putting together such an amazing event. Of course, we have a few housekeeping notes before we begin. To receive CLE for this program, you'll need to submit 2 codes, which I will provide during the program, once at the beginning and once in the middle. Please write down these codes. You will enter these codes into the Google form that you received in your welcome email. This form is also available on the ACS convention page under the CLE tab. If you need help with CLE, you can ask one of our volunteers for help after the program or email lcemails@acslaw.org. The first CLE code is Atlanta, and I will be providing the other one later on. We will reserve time at the end, obviously, for Q&A. Please write questions on the index cards provided at your tables and then raise index cards to alert our staff and volunteers that you have a question, and they will collect them from you. Those participating virtually have been given instructions for submitting questions as well. Now, on to the morning's discussion. As I mentioned last night, this year, ACS's theme, both around much of our convention programming and the work that we'll do in the coming year, is justice for everyone, securing constitutional rights in every community. Many of today's panels reflect on the ways in which rights are under attack and how the most vulnerable are often historically marginalized people in areas where conservatives have successfully concentrated power, including many areas in the South. In no area does this loom larger, perhaps, than when it comes to the right to abortion and the ways in which the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision has empowered conservative lawmakers to roll back reproductive rights. But you know, there is a flip side to all of this. In so many areas where conservatives appear to dominate, there actually are progressives working diligently who have attained public office to achieve their vision of a just and prosperous society. And I really feel lucky and honored to have 3 such people here with us today, and it's my pleasure to introduce them. First of all, I wanted to introduce our panelists who include to my, in the middle, this is slightly off, Chokwe Lumumba, the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. Next to him is Deborah Gonzalez, the district attorney for the Western Judicial Circuit of Georgia, which includes Athens, Clarke, and is it Oconee?
Oconee.
Oconee, thank you. I'm sure I was going to get it wrong, so I thought I'd ask. Oconee County here in Georgia. And finally, at the end, is Sam Park, a member of the Georgia House of Representatives, representing District 107 in the Atlanta metropolitan area. You can find more extensive, yes, please applause for these great people. You can find more extensive bios for each of them on our convention website, and I encourage you to check it out. It's really such an impressive thing to be able to achieve what you already have, and not the easiest part of the country, so we thank you for that. Let me kick it off by asking a few questions of Mayor Lumumba. So, you have the challenge, Mr. Mayor, of being the mayor of the most populous city, which is also majority black and one of, if not the most conservative states in the country, certainly one of the top 2 or 3. What opportunities have you had to make positive change during your tenure as mayor? I'm a former politician, so
Understood.
I know that's a kind of
That's a broad question, but it sets me up.
It's a big question.
Good morning, first and foremost. You know, I believe that we've had quite an extensive opportunity to engage community. What we seek to do is democratize power. The principle that guides my leadership is one of self-determination. So we seek means and opportunity to not only engage community, but involve them in the process of what their leadership looks like and what the solutions look like to their challenges, which is one of the principal issues that we have with the torrent of state legislation that attacks the city of Jackson, because it not only attacks the home rule and the ability for Jackson residents to direct the path that they want to move forward. And as the city of Jackson, as the residents have participated in the process of finding solutions to their challenges, we commonly see the reaction of the state which pushes back on that. Whether it's the notion that we believe that we needed anti-racial profiling bills or policies in our city, because we believe that when people come and live in our city, if they feel that they're under the threat of deportation or their documented status being reviewed just at any whim at any moment, then when you have women who may suffer sexual abuse, then they're not likely going to call the police. When you have people in our community who are undocumented and may deal with the challenge of being robbed because it is often known that they carry money on them because they do not have banks, then what people do in that situation is they find means of protecting themselves, which therefore you give rise to things like gangs and makes our community less safe. And so that's where we saw things like a state legislation that stopped sanctuary cities and was an attack on the city of Jackson. Right. And I know that we'll get into the conversation of 1020 and the other bills that attack our judicial system, which is not only an equal protection question, but it's also a question of a paternalistic nature and a voting rights challenge to people having the ability to have say-so over what their judicial system looks like. I am a recovering attorney for those in the room that are familiar, right?
Well, let me follow that, Mr. Mayor. One problem I never had as a legislator, but you do as a mayor, is you're on the line for everything. So you have to balance the goal of transforming governance, which you're obviously challenged to do there, with the more prosaic needs of a municipality and the basic services, public safety, and just say a bit about how one balances that in a municipality like that.
Well, hopefully I'm doing that well. I don't know. It's always the consummate challenge of there's always a difference between policy makers and policy implementers, and making sure that you give a proper balance of expectations and how things move along. And we've had tremendous success. What you ultimately find is that most people aren't afraid of change. Most people are actually afraid of loss. And so it's about how we adopt a narrative that is about our shared and collective gain. And while we've had significant challenges between the city of Jackson and the state of Mississippi, I don't want to express that it has just been without any ability to compromise over the course of history. One of the significant challenges I faced once I took office in 2017 is less than a month into office, I was faced by the state superintendent who dropped a big notebook on my desk and said that we're taking over your school system, right? And then the state school board voted to take it over. The state accreditation board voted to take it over. And it was all but the Tea Party governor's signature away from taking over our school system. But we were able to come in a spirit of compromise and looking to be diplomatic. And so what I expressed to the governor is I said, listen, understand that I know that you have friends that are investing in housing in the city of Jackson. Understand what that will do to their investment. Furthermore, when we look at state takeovers of school districts, they have been overwhelmingly unsuccessful. And in the most successful cases, there is a lot to be desired once it is transferred back into local control. And so the governor told me, look, I wish I had a third option. And so we went to the drawing board and we created a third option and presented it to him. And against all odds and against all expectations, we were able to come to agreement and work together. And so, unfortunately, he's no longer for some reasons, unfortunately, he's no longer the governor, right? And that same spirit isn't present. And so it's the polarized atmosphere that we're not only seeing locally, but nationally. I know everyone is seeing that makes it incredibly difficult in order to see progress take place. And I think that we have to have a spirit of operational unity, being able to focus on our common ends and objectives more than our differences. I'm not looking for someone who agrees to every notion or every policy that I agree with. I respect a man or a woman who has principles more so than, and principles that I disagree with, more so than a man or woman who has no principles at all. And sometimes we see that far too frequently.
Great answer. So not only were they messing with your school system, but you already alluded to the judicial moves. Can you say a little bit, explain the passage of HB 1020 and SB 2343, the creation of a state-appointed judicial positions in Hinds County and the expansion of authority and jurisdiction of the Capitol Police Force?
Absolutely. So this has been in the making for quite some time. Somewhere around 2016, there was a Capitol Complex bill, and it was submitted under the guise that the state was looking to provide funds for infrastructure projects within the Capitol District or the Capitol Complex that they were creating or drawing the lines, and it was supposed to entail those facilities that were state-owned facilities, and they were going to contribute towards road resurfacing and sidewalks and laying pipes. And so in a community that is in sore need of those infrastructure upgrades, it was enticing to many of the members of the Jackson or Hinds County delegation, and they supported it. But when you looked further in the bill, you saw that they were talking about creating a separate court system and all of those things. And so this was even prior to me taking office. We formed what we called the Coalition for Economic Justice. And we opposed the bill, much to the chagrin of some of our caucus, because they're fighting every day to get these resources. And so what we were concerned about is that it was a Trojan horse. And it ultimately proved to be a Trojan horse because they eliminated at that time the language about the judicial system and put that some of the additional revenue could be used for extra fire and police protection, with no true description of what that looked like and how that would be applied, and not providing it to the Jackson Police Department. And so more recently, in 2022, we faced the bills that you just described that created an expansion of the Capitol Complex jurisdiction and the police jurisdiction. So the Capitol Police were formerly just security guards in the state capitol, but now they have become a fully armed police force that has and we're not against additional protection, especially where it's needed, but what they have is limited oversight and limited cooperation with the community to envision what this looks like, what protection looks like. Because ultimately, people don't want to be policed. They want to be protected. And so there's a notion of how we work hand in hand. And community policing is just seeing the community as a resource and being participatory in that process. And so through that time, not only have they expanded past spaces where there are state-owned facilities, they've expanded in in an 83% black city, in an area which happens to be the most densely populated white portion of the city, which also happens to be the area with the lowest quotient of crime in the city, under the guise of wanting to protect people more sufficiently. And then lastly, and probably most heinously, they put in this bill the creation of a new court system, a court system which has the ability to prosecute people to the same extent that our circuit court system does and imprison people. And the judges would not be elected from the residents, but would be appointed by the Supreme Court justices and also the Attorney General in the state of Mississippi. And when the state legislator who brought this forward was at the dais explaining why he thought this was most appropriate, his explanation was they wanted to appoint him because we wanted to ensure that we got the best and the brightest, right? Which underpins the notion of inferiority and lack of understanding, or the belief in a lack of understanding of the people of Jackson to be best positioned to vote those individuals that they think best represent their interest of public safety and beyond. And so it's not only an equal protection question, as I stated, and it's not only a voting rights issue, it's paternalistic, and dare I say, and I owe you honesty, it's racist.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's truly a jarring story.
Yeah.
And of course, it made national news. So being able to hear it firsthand what this means is very important. One more for you, Mr. Mayor, before I turn to the others. Sort of related to,
No, I'm
how do you work with an system that allows for state legislative control veto over municipal policies and priorities? And how do you coordinate with other office holders in the state to sort of mitigate the problems that causes?
Well, I believe that the answer to that is one that I alluded to earlier in my comments, and that's, a task of operational unity. Being able to sit and have, dialogue with individuals. The challenge and the problem that we see is not only the legislation that's being put forward, but the notion that we don't deserve to be a part of the conversation of what our city looks like going forward. No one engaged anyone from Jackson. And in most circumstances, they don't even engage the legislators who represent our area. And so it's, someone from Senatobia, Mississippi, in this instance, which is about 2 to 3 hours away from Jackson, making the decisions of what our policy should look like. And I think that not only harms the residents of Jackson, but it creates an atmosphere of mistrust that ultimately harms our entire state. And when I'm critical in this way, I'm not critical because I don't love the state of Mississippi. In fact, my wife is an English literature professor, so forgive this reference. I think Mississippi is often looked at as the picture of Dorian Gray, right? Where we project all of the ills on the state of Mississippi and say, well, at least we're not Mississippi, right? And we have just cause to be looked at for some of the errors of our state, but we see a need for change across this nation. I believe President Obama said it best when he said the greatest form of patriotism is the notion that we're not yet done. And so I think we owe this critique to one another so that we can improve.
Well, despite the problems, we've had quite a good dose of Mississippi pride in conversations here, which I've thoroughly enjoyed. Let me turn to District Attorney Gonzalez. I want you to know that when you were elected, there was a lot of happiness at ACS, and we thought it was a thrilling moment. And, obviously the opportunities and constraints of serving as a so-called progressive prosecutor is an interesting question. How do you take advantage of the opportunities and work within the obvious constraints of the role you play?
Yeah, well, thank you. Good morning to everybody. Thank you, ACS, for having me back. So it's interesting because when they call you progressive prosecutor, many people just don't know what it means. Right? What is a progressive prosecutor? And one thing that I always start out with is that we are not a second public defender's office. We have a role to play. And are there constraints and opportunities? Absolutely. And that's because of something that we have, which is called prosecutorial discretion. And this is the authority for us to decide who to charge, what to charge them with, and a big influence on what the ultimate sentence is that they are going to serve. And many people have asked, well, if you're the DA putting people in, what do you care about how it is when people get out? And those two go hand in hand, right? Because 95% of individuals who are incarcerated will be released back to their communities. And are we preparing the communities, and are we preparing them? Because the last thing that we want is recidivism. And so there's a big opportunity in using that same prosecutorial discretion that created mass incarceration to reverse the trend, to look at alternatives such as accountability courts, restorative justice, community justice, in doing things that hold people accountable, keep our communities safe, but at the same time lay a foundation for a future sustainability and productivity in our communities.
Well, I'm going to ask you questions kind of similar to the one I asked the mayor. It has to do with, balancing your different roles, sort of the realities and misconceptions of what it means to be a progressive prosecutor, because You have to try to use the office to make policy, but there's also the case-by-case decisions that seek to address systemic or institutionalized injustices and biases. How do you do that?
Case by case is how we do it. One of the things that I did when I first came into office was I put out a day one memo, and it addressed 40 specific areas that we work with and what we would and would not do, including that we would not prosecute simple possession of marijuana, that I would not prosecute simple truancy, and I got sued for it. So that lawsuit is making its way up to the Georgia Supreme Court right now. We just had oral arguments on it to say that I did not have the prosecutorial discretion to make those kind of broad statements of what we would and would not do. Our argument is that we absolutely can make those. That is in our authority as the district attorney to be able to make those, right? And also the focus that we want on much more serious crimes other than somebody maybe having a joint, or we are a college town, right? UGA, go Dogs, gotta say that, okay? Twice champions. But there's a lot of, just saying. But there's a lot of misconceptions about what it means to be progressive, and a lot of pushback that comes out, oh, you just want to let everybody out, right? And crime is going to increase. Well, actually, crime has decreased almost 10% in my county since I became DA. But what you see is the pushback is they'll pick out certain things that happen and say, look, this is symbolic of everything that's happening across our circuit, when it's not. And so there's a lot of, we're used sometimes sort of as symbolic of all rogue prosecutors, of all reform prosecutors. And it doesn't help that the governor knows my name or that some of the representatives know my name, because I was a state representative before. And so, it is political in nature, right, what we do. And so you've got to balance being fair and just in prosecution, but also the political pressures that come with an elected position.
Well, it's not an easy role, but I am certain that there are people out there that are looking at you and saying, I think maybe I'd like to become a progressive prosecutor someday. And in that regard, what have you found to be the most effective means of achieving your aims of justice and fairness and public safety?
Doing the work. Having a progressive prosecution office is sort of based on this idea of fair and just prosecution. It means that I ask much more of my attorneys than maybe another DA office who is going to do it the traditional way, which is here's the crime, here's the time, there's the plea, right? What I ask instead of my attorneys is get to talk to the defense attorneys, get to know who the defendant is, really have those conversations with the victims, be engaged in the community. So I have a community outreach division, the first time ever, right, in my office. But that's because I believe there is so much that we can prevent from happening so that we don't have very young people coming in front of our courtrooms to be held. But it also means that my attorneys now have to do more work, right? They have to get to know how this is actually going to affect our communities. So what I ask them to do is answer the question every time that you have a case in front of you. The question to ask is, how does this serve justice, right? Whatever sentence I'm going to do, how does this serve justice? So an example of that would be, I don't emphasize that when we do plea negotiations, and by the way, 97% of cases are resolved by plea negotiations, not by trial, okay? But I tell them, don't start high to come low, right? That's your traditional negotiation avenue. What I say is evaluate the case and what is the fair sentence in this, and then stick to it, right? Because it's also about letting defense attorneys know we're not wavering from this. This is what's fair and just. This is where we're going to go. We're not going down. We're not going up. This is it, okay? And that means that, we're a system within other systems. And so defense attorneys have to learn that we're not going to play that game. Judges have to learn that we're not going to play that game.
District Attorney Gonzalez, you've already alluded to this, but say a bit more about the types of backlash you've experienced in response to your efforts, or the form it takes and how much that backlash is in response to real versus perceived things that you've actually done?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great question, and probably after I answer it, nobody will want to be a prosecutor or a district attorney. But I faced backlash even before I got elected. I had to sue the governor of this state to even have the election. They were going to cancel it. So we fought that. We won all the way up to the Supreme Court, and 150,000 voters were able to have that election, and it changed the law in Georgia. So that was good. And granted, that didn't mean that I had won the election. It just meant we could have an election, right? But then after I got elected, one of my 2 counties pushed in legislation to secede from the circuit so that they can form their own circuit and have their own DA because they didn't want me. I've had a noose found in my backyard. I've had my car keyed up in the courthouse garage. I've had threats, social media attacks. They did put in a law for a prosecutorial oversight committee that some reporters have dubbed the Gonzales Law because it was put in by the state representative in my area, specifically targeting me. So that will take effect on July 1st. So we'll see what complaints come up through there. I've been sued for what I've done. I've got harassed with open records request, basically 2 a day for 30 days straight, asking for more than 54,000 emails, text messages, and all of that has to be reviewed, and some things have to be extracted. I've had to hire somebody, get a new software. So all of that costs money, it costs time. And then, of course, just the negative messaging that's out there of me being a Soros-funded, liberal, bleeding heart, that I'm just going to let everybody out through that. And people say, well, how do you face that? I say, well, one, I don't read comments. I don't read the newspaper. And I just do my work, right? I just believe, last night in the dinner when they're saying, just keep doing it, no matter what happens, you just have to keep putting one foot in front of the other.
That sounds like a lot of fun. Thanks for your courage.
Thank you.
Finally, District Attorney, the most successful, you've talked a little bit about one approach is to get to know the folks that are relevant to the various stakeholders, but what's the message that you use to enlist support from communities or people that are not necessarily natural or expected allies? What's the most effective message?
Well, it depends on the audience that you're speaking with, right? You have to adjust your message to who's in the room. So there are some people, they want to know, how are you saving me money, right? There are some people who want to know, how are you keeping us safe? There are some people who want to know, well, do you share the same values that we do? So for example, the death penalty. We have a very big case happening in Athens. It was a death on campus. And the question came up, is this going to be a death penalty case? Well, death penalty costs $1.4 million in Georgia. It could take up to 20 years to go through. But on the date of arraignment, the DA has to make that decision of whether we're going to go forward or not. And I had always said I didn't believe in it, and I still do not believe in it. And I made the announcement that we were not going to pursue the death penalty. And, we get the pushback, as always, on that, but we do work with our faith community in that area, right? And so it depends on who the audience is. So a lot of things that we do are facts and stats. I don't necessarily like the idea of putting out conviction alerts. So look, this is what we did, but our community wants it. They want to see the work that we're doing. And so for very heinous crimes like child molestation, rape, murder, we do have those conviction alerts that go out. We do an impact report every year of all the cases that we've done, what we've resolved, what is the status in the office, how many attorneys we have, what's been going on. So we put out that information. We use social media, we use TikTok, we use Twitter or X, what they're called now. We use YouTube videos. Whatever it is in the mechanism that people receive information, we try to get those messages out in that way.
Thank you so much. Representative Park, thank you for your patience. I remember.
They want cold.
Oh, CLE code Athens? Am I right? Oh, I believe I am. I think I did that from memory, but let's see here. Athens. Thank you. Representative, delighted to turn to you. I remember when I was a young state legislator, my hair was the same color. Talk a little bit about the ways you seek to advance progressive aims absent a legislative majority, which I know is your situation.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Georgia for those who are out of state. Welcome to the cradle of the civil rights movement and the birthplace of Dr. King. For me, I've been in the minority for 8 years now, and it has been incredibly difficult. As the whip of the Democratic caucus, my primary obligations and responsibilities are first and foremost to stop terrible and dumb legislation. For example, earlier this year, frankly, we had a fight tooth and nail to stop an America First license plate because unfortunately Republicans did not realize the Nazi-related implications to that term. We had to fight multiple days against Republican efforts to erect a Clarence Thomas monument on the grounds of the state capitol, which we were successfully able to defeat.
Wow, thank you.
Of course, yes.
Good for you.
But of course, part of it is also mitigating harm without having a majority to fully having the ability to stop a lot of these bad bills. And so one example of what that looks like is for the past 2 years, we were doing everything possible to stop these new alien land laws that ban Chinese nationals from purchasing property in the state of Georgia, agricultural property and land near sensitive military installations. On its face, and this is a piece of legislation that passed in Florida and is currently being litigated in the 11th Circuit, but it was blatantly unconstitutional, facially discriminatory and violative of the Fair Housing Act. But over a 2-year period of time, we were able to address all of those aspects with partner coalitions, including the Georgia Realtors Association, to ensure that it wouldn't discriminate against Chinese nationals. It was more narrowly tailored and focused, though there were still constitutional preemption issues with the bill that ultimately passed earlier this year. But the last thing, as members of the minority without a legislative majority, is how do we make progress for our communities? How do we ensure and expand access to freedom, to ensure access to education across the state? How do we protect our communities from gun violence in particular? And so certainly challenging, but incremental progress is one way, at least over the past 8 years, in which we've had some victories.
Well, I certainly remember as a legislator that one of our biggest jobs was to kill bad bills. In fact, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee at the time was Judge Edelman, who was here. But, we were in the majority. So a lot of times it was bad bills that Democrats were supporting too. So
yes.
this, especially when it comes to things like civil liberties and the like. So flipping it, I don't know how much there's an opportunity for this, but how do you work with a majority to pursue your agenda? Is it possible?
It is possible. When all is said and done, I think some of the hyperpolarization that you see in Congress, while it has trickled down, I think because we are closer to the people, where, for example, in Georgia, we have 180 state legislative districts. You could win one of these districts with about 10 to 15,000 votes, right? So it's almost a municipal election. Because we are closer to the people, I think it creates room for greater bipartisanship. So the vast majority of the bills, even today, have overwhelming bipartisan support. They, for the most part, pass unanimously in the State House and in the State Senate. For me, when I was first elected as the first Asian American Democrat, the first openly gay man elected to the Georgia legislature, it was my desire to demonstrate that I cared about my home state just as much as folks who have been around for 5 to 10 to however long generations. And the way in which I wanted to convey that was to do the work, right? To ask tough questions in committee and to find common ground to the degree in which I could find common ground. And so by doing so, not only are you able to build relationships with folks across the aisle, and within your own party. But through those relationships, you then identify common ground, areas of interest, of shared concern, in which oftentimes that then lends to progress. So for example, on maternal mortality, Georgia has one of the worst maternal mortality and infant mortality rates in the country, in large part, in my opinion, due to the failure to expand Medicaid and access to health care across the state. This year, due to insistent lobbying by my Democratic colleagues, we finally passed a maternal mortality commission. And of course, a few years ago, we expanded Medicaid postpartum for 6 months and then 12 months. So there are areas in which, when all is said and done, we all represent people. We are all trying to do what is in the best interest of Georgians, which I think lend for some compromise and common ground to move some of these issues forward.
Well, we had a lot of reasons we wanted to come to the South for this convention, but one of the things that really emerges is the power of coalition building here in the South. Could you say a little bit about how that progressive movement advances your efforts?
Coalition building is absolutely critical. Georgia today is majority minority. We are a very, very diverse state. However, that is not reflected in our state government due to racial and partisan gerrymandering. On one hand, you have to build a inside-outside strategy to stop legislation and to make progress on your legislative priorities, but you also have to build a multiracial coalition within the legislature itself. The Democratic caucus, in my opinion, well, I think objectively speaking, represents the diversity of the state of Georgia. Whereas if you look at the Republican side of the aisle, it is homogeneous, 95% white, which does not reflect this majority-minority composition. And so part of that is from the outside working in, working with organizations like Asian Americans Advancing Justice to empower Asian American voters and new Americans, working with organizations like Galeo and the Hispanic community, again, to empower voters to register to vote, to increase civic participation, and then to come down to the Capitol, the People's House, to advocate and to ensure that their voices are heard. And of course, the foundation of that is the Black community. The Georgia Legislative Black Caucus being one of the largest in the country, if not the largest, in which we certainly as members of the Democratic Party feel we have to carry. It is our obligation to carry forth the legacy of the civil rights movement and the work to continue to build toward a beloved community.
Thank you, Representative. Let me now, before we go to Q&A, turn to some general questions that any of you can answer. And actually, the first one I'd like you all to answer, but in no particular order. What compelled you to public service, particularly in areas where achieving progressive aims may encounter resistance or backlash?
I'd be happy to start.
Representative?
Sure. Yeah. So for me, I back in 2014, my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. She was given about 4 to 6 months to live and 2 years with treatment, with chemo. That same year, back in 2014, Republicans blocked Medicaid expansion. They took away the power from the governor and required the legislature to expand Medicaid. And since then, it's been a consistent fight. And of course, the only reason why the Republican majority blocked Medicaid expansion was because it was a part of Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act. There was no legitimate public policy reason to block Medicaid, which ultimately was an incremental approach to expanding access to health care. But ultimately, with understanding that access to health care really is a matter of life or death, and that Medicaid, which covered 20% of my mother's health care expenses, which totaled about $30,000 every single month, and gave her a fighting opportunity, that is what ultimately compelled me to run for office. And though it's been an uphill battle, and while Georgia still has not yet expanded Medicaid, we again have made some incremental progress.
So when I was a state legislature, I worked a lot on the Judiciary Non-Civil Committee, which is all the committee that works on criminal laws. And we were working on a bill on death penalty, whether, Georgia is one of only 2 states who has a very high burden in terms of developmentally disabled people being released from being on the death penalty. And there is a group here called the Georgia Justice Reform Project of over 50 organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, like the Southern Center for Human Rights. And I was learning about all these things in the criminal system. And I had learned that in my particular circuit, they had only had 2 DAs in 48 years. And so I thought it was time for a change. And I learned about Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, and I said,
Yeah.
I like him. I like what he's doing. That's what we need here. And I ran, and I won. I became the first female DA in my circuit, the first Latina DA elected in Georgia, the first Puerto Rican female DA in the country elected. And so my impetus for running was not necessarily to be the first at anything, but that change was needed. And if I didn't step up, I mean, running for judge or running for DA is really perilous for some lawyers because they feel that if they don't win, they now have to move out of the circuit because they're going to be faced with practicing in front of this DA or this judge. And so it's very hard to get attorneys to run for these positions. So I'm inviting you now, when you get to that point, please run, okay? Because we need more progressive DAs, we need more progressive judges in those. So please run when you have that opportunity. But that's why I ran, because we need a change and nobody was running. 48 years, only 2 DAs, and I said, no, that has to change. So took the step, I was bold, as the judge said yesterday. Didn't know what was going to happen, but we ran and we won. And that's why I wanted to do that.
Yeah, one of our great speakers at the convention last year just said, run anyway.
That's right.
You know, regardless of the problems. Mr. Mayor, what compelled you to public service?
So I was incredibly fortunate to be raised by 2 lifelong community activists, not only in Mississippi, but you know, my parents were involved in a lot of work across the country. As a small child, my father had a case that lasted for 2 years in New York. He was representing Mutulu Shakur, Tupac Shakur's stepfather. At the end of that case, my parents decided that they wanted to move to the South. My mother wanted to go to South Carolina. We don't have any family there. I don't know exactly why. But my father, who had been in Mississippi in the late 60s and early 70s, working on human rights work, said that we needed to return. And so my parents, instead of shielding us from a movement, they felt that it was important to give us a sense of responsibility to community, just as important as giving us food, water, and shelter. So my childhood was spent in the Malcolm X Center for Self-Determination and Self-Defense, where we had day camps for children. My sister and I would do fish fries as high school students to do summer camps for kids. And so community work has always been a part of my reality. And so, you know, what we ultimately learned is that everyone isn't coming to the community center. You know, we're not going to create this self-determined environment expecting everyone to walk through those doors. And if you can only organize people who think like you, you're not much of an organizer. And so ultimately, some of my father's comrades convinced him to run for our elected position. And they tried to encourage him to run for mayor and for me to run for city council. And I was adamantly opposed. As a young law school graduate, I was invested not only in, you know, pursuing my work through my legal career, but I had my eyes on a young lady that is now my wife. And she was even more adamantly opposed than me, so it was easy just to say, well, if you can convince Ebony, you can convince me, knowing that there was no ability to do that. But February 25th, 2014, was the day that I learned that political leadership should come less out of political ambition and more out of necessity. That was the day that my father died 8 months into his term as mayor. And you know, he always said that he felt that this was better situated for me than for himself. And so I prayed and asked the Lord to put his spirit in me. And so I've been grateful that I've been carried, a very, very scary situation. And you know, there's so many things that I did not know at that time, and you know, surprise is still around every corner. So selfishly, because this was so important in our upbringing, selfishly, I feel that my continued work keeps them alive. I feel that Chokwe and Nubia Lumumba live in the people's struggle, and they will never die.
What moving and wonderful answers. Thank you, all of you. Ask the next question with a little bit of a caveat, because former Speaker Tip O'Neill said all politics is local. So when we Northerners say, well, what's it like? How's it different in the South? The South is not a monolith. It's not one thing. And I think that's really important for people to understand strategically. Nonetheless, we would like you to answer, you know, what do progressive policymakers around the country need to understand about the South that would be different than we might experience in other parts of the country? Whoever wants to take that.
Happy to jump in.
Yeah.
Sure. So, you know, I think certainly progress in the South looks different, and certainly progress in Georgia certainly looks different than progress in California or New York, to say the least. However, for me, it is really the understanding that if you want to make progress, you have to know where you come from, where you are, and the direction in which you are headed. And of course, while the South is certainly changing and not what it once was, where we have made significant progress, we cannot forget our dark history. And the fact that we remain, you know, our history, our inherited history, is that of the former Confederacy, which unfortunately perpetuates a lot of the inequities and inequalities that we're still fighting with today. And so in understanding those dynamics, certainly when it comes to state legislatures, where again you see unrepresentative government, how then do you make progress from there in trying to move toward those ideals of trying to ensure freedom, equality, and justice for everybody? Of course, in Georgia, we're still fighting over just some of these basic rights of voting. We've made a little bit of progress rather than having to wait, you know, 6 to 8 hours in line to vote. We've been able to shorten that period of time. Yet at the same time, it's almost impossible to vote by mail in the state of Georgia. You have to have a wet signature simply to get an application for an absentee ballot. And then, of course, when it comes to redistricting, there were a lot of incredible challenges there, in which after Shelby County v. Holder, that removed the protection of preclearance from a state like Georgia that was under those protections since 1965, what did this majority do? They diluted the black vote at the Congressional, State Senate, and State House levels. All the maps were struck down. And ultimately, remedy maps were passed, though they were still partisan gerrymandered. So progress takes a long time, given the long, dark history that we've inherited. But given the changing nature of the state, we have to understand that the fight forward is long, but there is a path forward.
Absolutely. So I would say that you don't seek progress being a revolutionary elitist, you know, thinking that you have all of the answers. And, you know, I shared a story of my parents, us moving originally from Detroit by way of New York, moving to Mississippi. And what it required was more than just our desire to help do the work in Mississippi. It was an immersion into the culture and understanding of why people have done the things and worked the way that they've worked traditionally. Through that understanding, you gain a greater sense of what's important and how things should be done. But I would say this, you know, racism is as American as apple pie, right? And it may look differently in different spaces. Kind of my quick synopsis is traditionally in the North, it doesn't matter how high you go so long as you don't get too close. In the South, it may not matter how close you get so long as you don't go too high, right? And we have to challenge that dynamic. And once again, you know, our greatest form of patriotism is the notion that we're not yet done and fighting and pushing back against that. You know, I find that, you know, as we take the everyday concerns that people have and use them as a platform to push towards the larger things in life. You know, growing up in a household of community activists, I have a propensity to talk to some of the larger things in life. Self-determination, human rights, exploitation. But when you're knocking on people's door to be mayor, you're invariably confronted by a brother or sister. Yeah, that's good, young brother, but how you gonna fix that pothole in the middle of my street?
Of course.
Right? And so in some sense, our responsibility is to connect pothole to pothole and community to community. So people in Jackson, Mississippi understand that there's a community that looks just like theirs in Gary, Indiana, suffering from that same pothole challenge. And in the process of fixing that pothole, what you ultimately learn is that the pothole was never your problem in the first place. Your problem is that you don't control the decision-making process that leads to a pothole being fixed, or you don't control the curriculum that educates your children, or you don't control the economic development that takes place in your community. And so your problem is a fundamental one, that you lack the self-determination to dictate the quality of life you so justly deserve. And so it goes to the notion of what Amilcar Cabral said. He said, people aren't fighting for the ideas in your head. They're fighting for the right to win material benefits to secure a future for their children, right? And so these are opportunities that we can take what may seem in the grand scheme as a mundane thing as an opportunity to leverage it into more important and expansive conversations.
Mr. Attorney Gonzalez, if you could answer that, and then we'll turn to a few questions for the last few
Sure.
minutes.
So one of the first things that I would say is to acknowledge that it is different. That if you're coming from the north to the south, be humble enough to listen and learn about where you're at now. The same things that work in the north do not work in the south for various reasons. It could be the history of it. It could be, the power structure of it. And I often will quote MLK, who says the long arc of history bends towards justice, but I emphasize that it is a long arc. And sometimes it feels like you're making 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But it's the idea that in the South, you have to be persistent. So the other quote that I like to offer is Banksy, the artist, who had this great mural, and it said, if you're tired, rest, don't quit. And that's what you need in the South. You need to be persistent, and you need to have a support system so that you can rest and somebody can take it over for a little while, and then they'll rest, and then you take it over. And that's why coalitions are so important here in the South, because no one person or no one group can actually do, right, everything on their own. We have to lean on each other because the obstacles that we have to deal with are so high and so serious. But it is so worth it and valuable for the people that we're fighting for every day. And so in the South, you need that persistence. In the South, you need that stubbornness. In the South, you need to almost be in their face and say, even my presence bothers you, so even though I'm not gonna say anything, I'm just gonna sit here and bother you for a while, right? In that way.
Very good. Let me turn to some questions. This reminds me of an incident that I was involved in my career when I was down in Alabama, and I decided it'd be a good idea after I saw, right after the Bush election, and I was kind of wondering why people voted for Bush, given the situation in Greenville, Alabama. I wrote a little column for Salon.com. The response was quite strong. And so how do you handle collaborating with well-meaning but paternalistic blue state progressives who don't always recognize the historic progressive tradition in the South? Because there are many. Anybody got an answer to that? Representative?
So for me, I certainly welcome all of the support from around the country when it comes to building power in the state of Georgia. I mean, we've seen historic investments, in which Stacey Abrams was able to help, harness that interest and power and really fundamentally change the electorate that has moved the state of Georgia leaps and bounds forward. A lot of that infrastructure still remaining on the C3 and the C4 side. Of course, there's always going to be challenges when it comes to an organizer's perspective if they're not familiar with some of the challenges or some of the opportunities that also exist, such as building that multiracial coalition on the ground. However, I still welcome it. It can be challenging at times, but it takes all of us.
The other answers? If not, I'll move on to the next one. So, how do you overcome voter cynicism about party politics? I mean, this is clearly infecting the situation in the elections this year. You know, especially knowing that you won't be able to deliver on all your progressive priorities. How do you, and I think many of our diverse communities are wondering about the party affiliation issue, and in some cases wondering whether some traditional alliances make sense.
Well, I think we're in an environment where you're seeing that cynicism more frequently, and it traditionally has always been seen amongst some of our younger demographic, where there's apathy, there's a lack of interest or engagement in the electoral process. I think it starts with an acknowledgement that, you know, there have been failures within the electoral process historically, that the status quo doesn't work. I think we're dealing with a generation that no longer wants you to drive them to the destination. They want the keys to the car. And so where I've found the greatest level of participation and support is when I engage community in a way that it isn't me telling them how I'm going to deliver a solution, but how I want them to participate in the process. My motto, my first time that I won, and I didn't mention when in 2014 when my father died, I ran for office. Within a 2-month period of time, I lost my father, had the birth of my first child, and ran in an election and lost, right? Which I'm grateful for, because I was able to gain a greater sense of responsibility and a notion of what we were dealing with, and a greater opportunity to personally grieve, but that's an aside. You know, but my campaign slogan when I won the first time was, when I become mayor, you become mayor, right? And that was more than just the notion of my responsibility and accountability to the residents of Jackson. It was a statement of what their obligation was. And when I was sworn in, I actually had the residents stand up and hold their hands and be sworn in as well, because I believe it will be our collective genius at the end of the day that will move us forward, not because one person has all of the understanding. And so the more that we, you know, empower people that your responsibility doesn't stop at the voting booth, and we give opportunities for things like participatory budgeting, so that we're not scratching where people aren't itching. We're not, you know, putting money to things and anointing its priority. We're not designing solutions for community and defending the merits of those solutions without community being a part of that process. And so I think that, you know, whether we're dealing with the partisan divide, whether we're dealing with, you know, apathy in voting, all of that is a lack of engagement historically that we've shown. You know, when we're trying to redirect people in Alabama from their votes for George Bush, right? Part of our failure previously is that we haven't shown up sufficiently enough so that people know who their allies truly are. I tell people, you know, people ask me after Donald Trump was elected, you know, how did we feel? And I told them the Wednesday after Donald Trump was elected, I woke up in Mississippi, right? And so I told them, you know, whether people supported Donald Trump, Barack Obama, or George Bush, if you were poor before them, you were likely poor after them. And so ultimately, you have a Republican Party who takes places like Mississippi for granted because they assume that it will always be red. You have a Democratic Party that looks at a place like Mississippi and says that it's forbidden territory, right? And so people aren't being engaged. It's not being demonstrated why people should be supporting you.
Mr. Trini, you have anything to say about that? Okay, well, this kind of relates.
Let him. That was good.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of relates to what the mayor was just talking about. The next question: where in your districts are the people who are not engaged, and how can you activate them?
Well, I did tell you that this was a college town.
Right.
And so engagement depends on the cause, right? So our young people, I wouldn't say they're not engaged. They can be very engaged in a particular cause, right? But not necessarily in the process, right? They're more about what is happening at this moment and how does it relate to me and that sort of thing. The other area where we do have disengagement is with the minority populations, right? Who feel that it doesn't matter whichever party I vote, nothing's going to change for me. And either they take me for granted or they don't even interact with me. And so this idea of going to where they are, and in the South, something that I've had to learn is the relationship between Black churches and politics. And we've been having this debate right now in Athens, Georgia, about, people who they expect politicians to go to church, the Black churches, and speak to them because that's where they are. But we also have a much younger minority population who are saying this is very hypocritical that politicians go on Sunday to churches, right? And so a lot of it, again, is who's in the room and where are you going to. So I feel so much more comfortable going to the barbecues that maybe the Black churches will have, or the family friends events, or making sure that I'm going with people that I know to these, but not just showing up, without any invitation or just to be there because I'm getting votes. And the other thing is just to go even when it's not election season, and just to be with them constantly, because that's the other thing that we get back, right? Oh, you're only here to get a vote. You don't really care about us. And so, when we talk about their engagement, it's also about how engaged are we as the elected officials, as the politicians, with that community, and whether we're going and showing up when they need us to be there. So that there is a two-way street, I think, in that area.
Well, I certainly, when you said that, remember the thing I was best at in politics was going to the barbecues. Anything that involved
Fish fries.
Food all over Wisconsin. That was the fun part. I think I've got to make sure that I'm discharging my responsibilities here. The first CLE code is Atlanta, and the second is Athens, just so people know. So I don't know if all of you want to answer this, but how do you fight legislation that attacks or limits prosecutorial discretion and their ability to decide not to prosecute certain crimes? Representative?
So we certainly had a lot of vigorous debate over the Prosecutorial Oversight Commission, in which they passed it last year. Part of the reason and justification that the majority party had for that was that it would require the Supreme Court to approve the rules that would govern that commission. The Supreme Court came back and said, we're not going to write rules for this commission. They came back this year and essentially passed legislation to bypass the Georgia Supreme Court, in which now you have a prosecutorial oversight commission created by partisans, appointed by partisans, with no real checks and balances. And so incredibly concerning and dangerous to ensure that there is separation of powers from a legislative perspective, in which oftentimes it feels at times as if the majority party wants to take us back to, just this one party, one, community kind of ruling, type of approach, which is incredibly concerning. If I could answer some of the previous questions, I think young people right now, they have every right and should be somewhat skeptical of political parties. The founders were skeptical of factions. What I try to convey is that political parties are ultimately, when all is said and done, mechanisms for change and empowerment. And so you have to work through them. And there's a distinction in terms of the party politics and your right to vote within the democratic framework. Right? Only in a country like ours, only in a democratic system like ours, is a story like mine or Deborah's even possible, in which as immigrants or as children of immigrants, we now have an opportunity to get elected, to lead, and to serve. Right? And that's something that we have to do everything within our power, certainly this year, to protect that mechanism, with the understanding that, again, political parties are not perfect, but certainly the distinctions today cannot be clearer.
If I could,
Yeah, Mayor.
he enticed me with that. I think it's also a notion of, we're talking about partisan divide quite significantly this morning. And I think that we have to be clear that we not only challenge our opposition, we have to challenge our friends, right? Because as I said previously, you can be taken, for granted by both sides. I remember during the last presidential or national election cycle, many of my mayor friends, we were all being engaged by all of the Democratic candidates. And early on, I was a part of a leadership initiative where one of the candidates brought together 40 mayors from across the country, across the world actually, for a leadership initiative, and we learned of his interest of running for office. And three of us, they engaged on the side and pretty much made it clear his interest in running. And so what I shared with then Mayor Steve Benjamin of Columbia, South Carolina, Randall Woodfin of Birmingham, Alabama, and myself, I said that, it's not helpful for us to just endorse a candidate, take some pictures, be a part of a moment, and then they leave and never are present in our communities again. And so what we decided to do is that we would adopt a agenda for our communities. And we called it the Southern Mayor's Agenda. In fact, there was an article that said, that published it, and it was called The South Has Something to Say. And what we ultimately decide is that we may or may not all endorse the same candidates, but none of us would endorse any candidate that did not adopt our agenda for our communities, right? And we have to be more present. And so that led to a level of engagement that we've never seen in Jackson, Mississippi. We saw, Elizabeth Warren doing her CNN town hall in Jackson, Mississippi. I saw every candidate coming to Jackson, Mississippi, and that never happened before, right? And that is the mechanism that ultimately led, when I've been dealing with decades and decades of a willful neglect of our city's issues from our state in terms of our water distribution system, and the fact that we've been underfunded, and there was a Title VI complaint levied against the state of Mississippi for its discriminatory funding to the city of Jackson. So that ultimately led to the pathway that we were able to go to U.S. Congress and talk to Senate Appropriations and get $800 million for our water system, right? Wow. But the building blocks of that took place a lot sooner than the moment that we actually were able to receive that. And so it's important that we not only challenge our enemies, but challenge our friends. Our opposition.
Thank you for that. We just have a couple more minutes, but let me turn to the district attorney for this one, because you represent, or in your district as a college, university. What would you say to the law students here about what they can do to promote state level progressive policy on their campuses?
Yeah, get involved just about, I know on UGA they have student groups for just about anything and everything. And so get involved in those student groups. And have those student groups engage with elected officials. I mean, I don't think there is a single elected official that if a student group asked them, would you please come and talk with us, that they would say no. So sometimes it's just taking a little bravery, send that email, make that call, but we are more than happy to come and speak, especially with young people. And I think that's really important, is just to have these opportunities of engagement. To talk about what it is. Because one of the problems that I find over and over again is nobody knows what a DA does, right? It's a district attorney. What does that mean? What do you do? Are you just like what we see on television where you're in the courtroom and banging on the desk? No. The DA, that's usually the prosecuting attorney that's in the courtroom, but a DA has all of these other administrative things that they have to do. And so even though we don't make the laws, we enforce the laws. And we do that through the policy that we set. And so it's really important that we educate our communities about what we do, about what the laws are, and that's happening there.
Let me finish with just a question from me that I'd like each of you to answer because of the roles you play. What is the greatest opportunity, in your view, for progress in the South? Representative?
For me, I think that, and I'm certainly working toward building a new Georgia. That actually lives up to our highest values as Americans. I think the mayor said it right in terms of ensuring that folks feel empowered and have the control and freedom to determine their respective futures. Everybody ultimately wants that, but we are certainly not there just yet. And it requires, again, building that multiracial coalition based on common ground, based on shared hopes and dreams. And so long as we are investing in people and educating them as to their own power, because I think that also feeds into the cynicism that we experience, in which people, especially given all the uncertainty that we're experiencing, feel as if they are powerless. No, as voters, as American citizens, and especially as young people, we have an incredible amount of power. Millennials, Gen Z, that is a new majority in this country, in which if we simply exerted that power, especially in a place like Georgia, we could fundamentally change not just the face of who is in power, but actually pass meaningful legislation that improves everybody's lives.
Mr. Mayor.
I'd answer that in two ways. One, in terms of this new generation, I think that we have to take this energy that we see amongst young people and concretize it, take it from this mystical, mysterious place and better organize it. I think that that's one. But then I'll give just a electoral map answer. Mississippi is the greatest place for progress or opportunity. First and foremost, what we've recently seen in Georgia turning, what was known as a certain red state into a purple one, right? Just demographically alone, if we can take from the lessons of Georgia, Mississippi is 40% African American, right? That's more than likely why we see such heavy resistance to our policies, because of fear of what Mississippi, if properly engaged, could be. And more than just a conversation about Democrat and Republican, and I'll be clear, I am a Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party member, fashioned after Fannie Lou Hamer, right? More than just that is if we can have this diversity of thought, then it leads to a better yield at the end of the day, a better policy that supports the life and the quality of life of every individual. And so I think that we have to start engaging on a much higher level than what we've traditionally done. And so I look forward to doing that and being a part of it.
I know you will. District Attorney Gonzalez.
So part of me sort of feels I can't answer the question, because to me the answer lies with all of you. That's the opportunity, the potential that each of you have as to what you want to see happen in the South, right? Because I'm a little old, and my time as a public servant is going to come to an end much sooner than yours. But you guys get to start from a clean slate. You guys get to start from what's been built, and then take it from there in whatever area or way that your imagination can take you. So I don't want to give you an answer that would limit what you yourselves can create for our future.
What a wonderful opening plenary. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure the audience did as well. Thank you so much.